Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. The life of Saint Benedict. So we left off looking at the instruments of good works, how to practically, the rule of Saint Benedict shows practically how to live the gospel, how to really do it. It's really the perfection of that life. Can you open that curtain in the middle? To clothe the naked, to visit the sick, to bury the dead, to help in afflictions, to console the sorrowing, to keep aloof from worldly actions, to prefer nothing to the love of Christ, not to follow the promptings of anger, not to seek an occasion of revenge, not to foster deceit in one's heart, not to make a feigned or fake peace, not to forsake charity, not to swear, lest perchance one perjure oneself, to utter the truth with heart and lips. So in other words, to utter the truth with heart and lips. In other words, don't tell lies. Yeah, don't tell lies. Don't be a liar. Not to render evil for evil, to do no wrong to anyone, but to bear patiently any wrong done to oneself. So to love one's enemies, not to render railing for railing. What's that?
Violence.
Violence, or being argumentative just for argument's sake. Railing. And railing. To complain or protest strongly, persistently about. To bellow, to jest. To complain bitterly, scold, or criticize in a harsh, abusive language. That's railing for railing. So if people use abusive and harsh language on us, we don't return harshness. All right? Not to render railing for railing, but rather blessing, to suffer persecution for justice' sake, not to be proud, not to be given to wine. But the monks have a glass of wine every day, especially in the summer when they're working hard. But what's that mean, not to be given to wine?
Don't get drunk.
Not to be a drunkard and addicted. Not to be a glutton. Not to be given to sleep. Not to be slothful. Not to be a murmurer, that is complaining and murmuring, always complaining under one's breath. And if there's a problem, you just don't bring it up to the superior or to the father. You just keep complaining. It's better to just bring things up to the superior or the father of the house. Not to be a detractor, to put one's hope in God, to attribute any good that one sees in oneself to God and not to oneself. Now that's truth. But to acknowledge evil as having been done by oneself and to impute it to oneself. To fear the day of judgment, to be in dread of hell, to desire everlasting life with all spiritual longing, to keep death daily before one's eyes, to keep guard at all times over the actions of one's life, to know for certain that God sees one in every place, not to love much speaking, not to speak words that are vain or such as provoke laughter, not to love much or noisy laughter, never to despair of the mercy of God. So that's directly from the rule of St. Benedict. Obviously, he doesn't condemn laughter and laughing, because monks very often laugh, and sisters too, from the joy of the religious life. But it's the barroom laughter. That's what he bans. The barroom laughter, the mocking type of laughter, the worldly type of laughter. The routine of the monastery was very similar to that followed by St. Anthony and other solitaries, with the added stimulus of better order and communal activity. The monks would rise at about 2 o'clock in the morning to chant at a night office or vigils, now called, what divine office? Matins. And this even in winter, when unheated rooms with unglazed windows were none too comfortable. After an hour or two, they would study for a while. Then they would assemble in the chapel for what office follows? Lauds. Thus, 7 times during the day and night, they would give praise to God in the beautiful old words of the Psalms, composed many centuries ago by King David, and long sung by the Hebrew solitaries on Mount Carmel, and by the Christian hermits of the Thebaid, such as St. Anthony and St. Paul the Hermit. So who can name all the 8 hours of the office? Michael.
Matins, lauds, prime, sextus non, vespers compline.
Good, you missed 1 at 9 a.m.
Second lauds.
Oh, no. Terce.
Yeah, terce. Terce is the 9 o'clock hour one. The 3rd hour, which is 9 a.m., which is the hour of Pentecost. On Sundays and great feasts, all attended Mass and received Holy Communion. About 4 hours a day were devoted to intellectual work, so that's classes and reading and study. And from 4 to 6 hours to manual labor. For idleness, said St. Benedict, is the enemy of the soul. He arranged that the monastery should be self-supporting and not dependent upon the gifts of the rich. For he knew that few monasteries had died of poverty, while many had been corrupted by wealth. Yeah, that's true. When the monks stop doing manual labor, that's when they usually get easily more corrupt. Naturally, the chief labor was agricultural, so farming and animals. No distinction was made, however, between manual work and the fine arts, to which the more talented were allowed to devote their times, provided they did not forget the essentials of God's service. Quote, should there be craftsmen in the monastery, carpenters, plumbers, stone cutters, let them exercise their crafts with all humility and reverence. If the abbot so command, but if one of them grow proud because of the knowledge of his craft, and that he seems to confer some benefit on the monastery, let such a one be taken away from this craft and not practice it again, unless perchance after he has humbled himself, the abbot may bid him resume the craft. If any of the work of those craftsmen is to be sold, let those through whose hand the business is to be transacted see to it that they presume not to mingle into it any dishonesty. In setting the price of those things, let not the sin of avarice enter in. Tell that to the modern businessman. And he says elsewhere, I don't know if he'll quote it, but he does say later, if you sell furniture or if you sell bread or whatever the monastery might sell to be self-supporting, let it be sold at a cheaper price and not, impossible to pay for. St. Benedict's shrewd and kindly knowledge of human nature in that turbulent age peeps forth sometimes with a sly irony, from many parts of his holy rule. For example, let each one sleep in a separate bed. If possible, let all sleep in one place, a huge dormitory room. But if the number does not permit this, let them sleep in 10s or 20s with the seniors who have charge over them. A lamp shall burn constantly in the cell until morning. Let them sleep clothed and girded with cinctures or cords. But let them not have knives at their sides, lest perhaps they wound themselves in their sleep. At meals, someone always read aloud, and no one might interrupt or ask questions. The brethren were to help serve one another, and if one of them desired some article, he must ask for it by signs, so no speaking. Hence, the Benedictine sign language, which Cluny really developed, the monastery of Cluny in the 8, 9, 1000s, and from that originated the sign language for the deaf. So the modern sign language, a lot of it's based on the monastic monks. So is beer. The recipe for beer making also is thanks to the monks. The dinner was usually at the 6th hour, 12 noon, or 12 o'clock noon, and consisted of 2 cooked dishes, because of, quote, because of the weakness of various persons, so that he who perhaps cannot eat of the one may make his meal of the other. And if there be any fruit or fresh vegetables, let a 3rd dish be added. Each man received daily a pound of bread, which must do also for supper, usually just before dark. So at each setting in the morning would be placed a pound of bread. That's a lot of bread, isn't it? That's a good weight. And that was their meal, that was their bread for the breakfast, lunch, and the dinner. If the labor was heavy, the abbot might make some extra allowance, always guarding against surfeiting. For nothing is more unworthy of any Christian than gluttony, as our Lord says. Take heed to yourselves, lest perhaps your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness. All the brothers were to take turns serving in the kitchen. So sometimes in a monastery you'd get, really high up nobles, and sometimes cardinals and bishops who would become monks. So they'd be doing dishes with all the other brothers. So next to him might be a brother who was, a slave all of his life, from a family of slaves. And here is a big nobleman doing dishes with a slave. Such is the charity of Christ. As for drink, St. Benedict advocated and no doubt practiced total abstinence from alcohol, but did not insist upon it for others. He says, "It is with some hesitation that we undertake to determine the measure of nourishment for others. However, making due allowance for the infirmity of the weak, we think that a hemina, about a pint of wine a day, is sufficient for each." So drinking a pint of wine a day. So that's a big full glass. That's about 16 ounces?
Yes.
So a hemina of wine, in the many commentaries say they're not sure what that measurement really was. But William Thomas Walsh just picked one and says it's about a pint. So about a pint of wine, that's a lot. That's 3 or 4 glasses. Right? That's 3 or 4 glasses of wine. We think that a hemina, about a pint of wine a day, is sufficient for each. But let those to whom God grants the gift of abstinence know that they shall receive their reward. For those who make a sacrifice not to drink wine, God will bless them. If either the nature of the place, or the labor, or the heat of summer requires more, it shall be in the power of the superior to grant it, care being taken in all things that surfeiting or drunkenness do not creep in. Although we read that wine is by no means a drink for monks, yet since in our days, this is St. Benedict speaking, since in our days the monks cannot be convinced of this, let us at least agree to this, that we do not drink to satiety, but sparingly, because, quote, wine maketh even the wise to fall away. Should, however, the nature of the place be such that not even the above-mentioned measure can be had, but much less, or even none at all, let those who dwell there bless God and not murmur, not complain. Well, the Spirit, he's only allowing us half a glass of wine. This isn't fair. This, above all, do we admonish, that they be without murmuring, so no complaining. Of great importance in view of the above was the choice of the man in charge of the wine, which the monks made from grapes. They grew themselves. He says, let there be chosen out of the community as cellarer of the monastery, a man who was wise and mature of character, temperate, not greatly given to eating, not haughty, not turbulent, nor offensive, nor indolent, nor wasteful, but one who fears God and will be, as it were, a father to the whole community. So this is the great role of the cellarer. The cellarer, which would be the equivalent of prefect of maintenance, I suppose. Let him have charge of all things, but do nothing without the permission of the abbot. Let him watch over all that is entrusted to him. Let him not give offense to the brethren. If, however, a brother ask him unreasonably for anything, let him not wound his feelings by spurning him, but let him reasonably and with humility refuse him who thus asks amiss. Let him be watchful over his own soul. Let him care with special solicitude for the sick, the young, the guests, and the poor, knowing without doubt that he will have to render an account of all these on the day of judgment. Old men and children also were to have special consideration. He says, St. Benedict, let their weakness be always taken into account, and let the full rigor of the rule as regards food be in no way exacted in their regard. But let a kind consideration be had for them, and let them anticipate the regular hours. Like the primitive Christians, the monks of all ages practiced the true communal sharing of goods, of which modern communism and socialism, so-called, were to be wretched perversions or caricatures, substituting force for free renunciation of self, compulsion for charity, and the sharing generally of poverty rather than of wealth. The Christians of the first century, says the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verse 44, had everything in common. In selling their possessions and belongings, they distributed the proceeds to all according to the needs of each one. And all through the centuries, the Church, mindful of these words of her founder, has recommended as a counsel of perfection to those strong enough to accept it voluntarily, the same radical solution of the social problem. Inevitably, then, the renunciation of private property became the fundamental requirement of monastic life. And St. Benedict was hardly an innovator when, in his chapter on whether the monks are to have anything of their own, he wrote the following in the Holy Rule. Above all, let this vice be rooted out of the monastery, namely that one presume to give or to receive anything without leave of the abbot, or to keep anything as his own, absolutely anything at all, whether a book or a writing tablet or a pen or anything whatsoever, since they are to have not even their own bodies or their wills in their own keeping. They may, however, expect to receive from the father of the monastery all that is necessary. So they give up everything, but they're not in need of anything, really. You have a pen, you have a pencil, you have your pillow, you have your bed, you have your boots, you have your 2 or 3 tunics.
Your own toothbrush.
Yes. So you really don't need anything. It's a much freer life. But they may not keep what the abbot has not given or permitted. Let all things be common to all as it is written, but let no one call anything his own or claim it as such. Should, however, anyone be found addicted to this most wicked vice, let him be twice admonished, and if he be not amended, let him be punished. These are all direct quotes from the Holy Rule. If rich parents ask the monastery to accept their son, they must in the same petition promise under oath that they will never, either themselves or through an intermediary, or in any other way whatsoever, give him anything, or offer him opportunity of possessing anything, though they might bestow property on the monastery, reserving the life use if they choose. By this means, every opportunity is to be forestalled for the child to come to any knowledge of how he might have been circumstanced in the world, for because of this knowledge he could be deceived and brought to ruin, which God forbid, as we have learned by experience. Those who are less affluent are to do in like manner, but those who have no property at all shall simply make the petition. Now the effect of all this on society, back to William Thomas Walsh, the effect of all this, the Benedictine rule, on society was exactly the opposite to what a learned pagan of about 100 BC might have deduced from purely human premises. Such a man, stuffed with all the secular knowledge of his time, might have predicted that the teaching of celibacy, voluntary poverty, and absolute obedience to religious authority would dissolve the very frame and substance of society, destroy marriage, the home, the family, property, security, such freedom as existed, government itself, depopulate and ruin the world. So that's a common objection of many people. Yeah, well, you talk about the importance of virginity and chastity and monks and sisters. But if everybody became a monk and a sister, there'd be no more marriages. There'd be no more children. Well, that's a dumb argument because not everybody will become monks and nuns. All are invited, but not everybody will in practice do it. Right? So that's a dumb argument. It might not have occurred to him that paganism itself was accomplishing these very atrocities. Never was marriage more neglected and debased, property more tightly clutched in a few hands and denied to the many, personal freedom more rare, government more dependent upon whim, bribery, bloody revolt, and oppression than at the time when Christ came into this world to begin its gradual transformation. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. He who loses his life for my sake shall gain it. He who gains his life shall lose it. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all these things shall be added unto you. These were not the poetical vaporizings of pagan philosophers or liberal politicians, but a sword of practical truth sheathed by divine wisdom in paradoxes to protect it from fools and scoundrels, and them from it. Very well said. From a humanity thrown off its spiritual balance by the fall of Adam and Eve, and fatally disposed to divorce pleasure from responsibility, the holy extreme of asceticism was needed to offset the downpour of sensuality and egotism towards the abyss of moral and social anarchy. By giving heroic examples of self-control, the monks were drawing other men back to the normal practice of it. Thus, the celibates gained for other men freedom from slavery of debauchery and perversion, the primitive health of marriage in which enjoyment is kept sane and clean by responsibility as the ocean by salt. The homeless and childless won for others safe homes in which to rear their children. Such homes, in fact, must follow logically from the restoration of marriage as a sacrament. And the freedom of the home with that of the individual demanded a certain amount of private property. Ownership for most men was a necessary corollary of the Christian ideal of the family. And insofar as their teaching banished tyranny, avarice, and lust, three deadly enemies of the home, the men and women who willingly gave up all property were certain that others should enjoy it the more securely. So think of it. What effect does a whole monastery or seminary or convent, monks and nuns who embrace poverty, chastity, obedience, what effect does that have on the average Joe?
Well, it encourages the average layman to fulfill his duties in the state of life with fervor, and depending on what state of life he's in, like if he's married, it encourages him to keep his vows, since he sees that these individuals who gave up the joys of marriage are keeping and are trying to keep their vows.
Yes, so if he's a little bit too loose and thinking of another woman than his wife, well, visiting the monastery and seeing the monks and knowing that they just exist on top of that mountain, praying and doing penance for the whole world, that alone is like a lighthouse that sheds its light, says St. John Chrysostom, for all to see. So the good example affects everybody else. So he might be tempted to commit adultery, but knowing their good example, let me just be faithful to my wife. Right? He might be jealous of others' property, but when he knows that they have no property, the monastery, they take a vow of poverty, he'll restrain himself and say, I'll just be happy with what I have. Right? So the good example of these religious is very powerful. And Our Lady of Ecuador, Quito, Ecuador, she said to Mother Mariana, you have no idea how many tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, fires, and hurricanes, and all kinds of natural disasters are averted by the prayers of the monks and the nuns. All right. In every domain of life, the Spirit of Christ's teaching, as concentrated and elaborated in St. Benedict's rule, had its dynamic and revitalizing effect, and always in the same paradoxical way. Artists who placed God before their art and their own joy in it were presently to create the sublimest art, music, literature, and architecture in the whole history of vagrant man. So monks who were skilled craftsmen, their art would go for the glory of God. And you know those masterpiece Gregorian chants that we sing throughout the year? Masterpieces of beauty, of poetry, and symmetry and measure. It's the monks. But they sought the glory of God in it. And in many statues, many carvings in the cathedrals of Europe and monasteries, you won't find an autograph on a statue or painting. You won't find autographs. The heat is making everybody sleepy. Yeah, well, stay awake. If you need to stand up, stand up. All right. It is the Gothic cathedral and not the cold Parthenon. You might mean here the Pantheon, but Parthenon, or the equally slavish mass of the modern skyscraper that fairly sings and vibrates with the various personalities and even eccentricities of thousands of individual artists, rejoicing in the strength of free creation because, as Ruskin noticed, Christianity had insisted upon the value and dignity of each separate soul. And it was the humble monks, with their insistence upon the proper subordination of reason to faith, who were to conserve through the centuries of chaos all the antique attainments of reason, and then to establish the great medieval universities, the hospitals, the laboratories, indeed the whole pattern of European life for centuries. What an important point. So in some of these monasteries, you literally had geniuses who were monks. And with permission of their abbot, with permission and so forth and so forth, they would write incredible treatises. And on all sciences as well. Right? They perfected the grafting of trees and olives and grapevines. They perfected the making of liqueurs and wine and good beer. That's from the monks. Architecture, medicine, rooted in the monks. So, St. Anthony had planted the seed of this marvelous growth in the desert. St. Athanasius and St. Patrick had transplanted it to the west and north. It was St. Benedict's task to purify and strengthen it, making it adaptable to all times and places and to all sorts of men and women. A great deal of his success was due to his profound knowledge of the human frailties that might oppose his work, and the wisdom with which he provided remedies. No detail was unimportant. He carefully prescribed for the care of the sick, the excommunication and possible restoration of serious offenders, the reception of guests. So understood, this excommunication in a monastery is not the church official censure. It's just a big punishment for someone who deserves it in the monastery. So a monk who's really rebellious, a monk who's really, a bad example, and he doesn't want to try his best and observe the rule, and he's breaking the rule all the time, he might be excommunicated, that is, separated from the community of the monks, and the older monks would go talk to him and say, try to bring him back to good reasoning and good thinking, and, adjust his attitude by, in a fatherly way. It's like the kid that's kicked out of class, or even suspended from school. This happens. And some of the older teachers go talk to him and try to say, look, you're a good student, but you've got to correct this and that, and if you do this, you're going to be a good student, you'll graduate with honors, stuff like that. No detail was unimportant for St. Benedict. Let all guests arriving at the monastery be received as Christ himself, for he is one day to say, I was a stranger, and you took me in. And let due honor be paid to all, especially, however, to those who are of the household of the faith and to strangers. In curious contrast to this is the passage in which he anticipated the inevitable tension that was to arise between the monks and secular clergy, with which St. Gregory was to deal so wisely. If any one of the priestly rank asks to be received into the monastery, let no permission be too quickly granted him, until he has been made well aware that he shall be obliged to the full rigor of the rules, and that nothing shall be relaxed in his favor, according to that which is written, Friend, whereto art thou come? So priests who come into the monastery thinking they should get special treatment, St. Benedict is saying, you're not. You're going to do dishes, you're going to scrub toilets with all the other brothers. You're going to sweep the floors, and so forth. Perhaps St. Benedict was thinking of the fallen priest, Father Florentius, when he quoted these words spoken by Christ to Judas, Friend, whereto art thou come? At all events, he had no intention of letting such a priest disrupt the harmony of any monastery of his, under cover of the respect due to holy orders. He further cautioned that if a monk was to be ordained a priest, he must beware of arrogance and pride, and presume to do nothing that is not commanded him by his abbot, knowing that he is now all the more subject to regular discipline. Let him always keep the place due to him according to his entrance into the monastery, except during the exercise of his priestly functions, and obey the commands given him by the dean and the prior. Should he presume to do otherwise, let him be treated not as a priest, but as a rebel. If such a priest did not amend after the bishop has been brought as a witness, let him be cast forth from the monastery. So kicking out priests who come into the monastery thinking, I'm a priest, so I need special privileges. That's not how it goes. And same with seminarians of the SSPX, Marian Corps or St. Pius X. Priests have to be seminarians too. The faithful bend over backwards to show you their love and their gratitude and their help, but we should never take it to our heads, ever. Never become conceited and pompous and proud and arrogant. Never. But many priests easily do because, the priest is the priest. We respect the priest. Nobody ever gives trouble to the priest, rarely. So there's a great danger for seminarians and priests, even seminarians. I've seen that in the seminary. It's kind of humorous. I'm a fourth year. You're just a second year. I mean, it's fun. It's one thing to joke about it, but it's another thing when they really take it serious. I shouldn't be on dishes because I'm a fourth year. Well, who cares? You dirtied the dishes. You dirty the toilet, so you take your share. So everybody gets a turn, even deacons. Deacons are supposed to be more on the waiter list, there's always a deacon in charge of the waiters. So this is very important as a priest, very, very important. And many priests become proud and pompous and arrogant, and it's very dangerous. And when they're proud and they're priests, it's very hard to save a soul of a wayward priest. Very hard, because they're so proud. They're so, dangerous, very dangerous. So you want to be humble of heart. Always pray for that grace. Be humble of heart. Be humble of heart. And yes, these are very great warnings from St. Benedict. Okay, we'll stop there and pick up next time. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.